about the policy entrepreneurs already, they have a really tough time creating space for the traditional and the social entrepreneurs because they have to fight vested interests to do that. So they have a very difficult political economy challenge, which is they're always going to be facing people either within the government or very powerful private sector folks who are not going to want them to do what they need to do to create a supportive, enabling environment to create a really, truly free economy. Let me give you one example. I spend a lot of time working on property rights issues. And probably for all of us, we think, well, of course it makes sense. Of course it's sensible for governments in the developing world to create more secure rights over property, whether it's individualized property or communal property. We know it's important to have, for individuals to have rights, secure rights in their property, because when they do, then they invest in the property, they conserve the property, they put it to good and profitable use. So we would expect governments in the developing world really quick, like this is low-hanging fruit. You'd expect them to say, well, duh, of course we need private property rights. Let's go to the legislature, let's pass some new laws, let's get it implemented. You actually don't see this happening a whole lot. And it's not because people don't understand that secure rights to property are really important to promote economic growth. Everyone knows this. This is part of that recipe I was talking about before, or the necessary conditions. Having secure rights to private property, Professor Pipes talked about it. You cannot have an economically thriving society, and you can't have individual freedoms and liberties unless you have secure rights to private property. But governments will not implement laws. They will not enforce laws that might exist on the books to protect private property in a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because people on the ground benefit from insecurity. People who are very powerful benefit from the ability to trade properties over and over again, to sell properties repeatedly. They benefit in a variety of ways from being able to allocate the property. If you're the person who allocates property in a country, you're a very powerful person. You don't necessarily want to create secure, individualized, or even secure collective rights to property because then you become a little less powerful within the society. So even though we know some of the things that are important in order to promote economic growth, we oftentimes don't see government leaders doing what we know that, or what we think they should do, because if they do, they run up against a really difficult challenge of vested interests. The traditional entrepreneurs, well, their challenge is, oh my gosh, how am I going to do business in a kind of dysfunctional environment? And most sub-Saharan African economies are dysfunctional in a variety of ways. There's not security of property rights, so you have to work around that. You can't get access to credit for a variety of reasons, usually because the government has a highly regulated banking system. You can't enforce contracts through the formal legal system because the formal legal system is partial. You don't really want to go there. There's not good security. There are high crime rates. You have to deal with all those sorts of challenges. But yet, these folks are constantly working. If any of you have traveled to sub-Saharan Africa, you know the most dynamic parts of the country are always the informal markets. There's always business going on. People find workarounds, but they tend to get stuck in an informal economy and tend to have real problems growing businesses from smaller micro level businesses to large scale businesses. So these folks can do a lot of good, but they tend to face legal and regulatory barriers that make it hard for them to do even more. Social entrepreneurs, what are the challenges they face? Well, because a lot of them are sort of like bleeding heart types. They're MBAs with bleeding hearts. That would be one way to think of it. They always have to be mindful of sustainability. They need to create businesses that are going to be profitable. And for them, it's not so much, and then they do have to operate in these dysfunctional environments. But for them, being mindful of the sustainability seems to me is their major challenge. So what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes, and I'll do it fairly quickly, are two examples that I've seen and I've studied quite a lot of policy entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa. And I focus on the policy entrepreneurs again because I think they actually have the toughest job. And we really do need to encourage them. We need to highlight their cases and talk about why this has done so much good for people on the ground, the kind of work that these folks have done. So the first example I'm going to talk about is policy entrepreneurship in Rwanda. You may or may not know much about Rwanda. In the clip that we just saw in Professor Ottison's class, one of the people who was interviewed, nobody was identified, but one of the people who was interviewed was Paul Kagame, who's the current president of Rwanda. Kagame got to be president because he stopped the genocide. He and his forces stopped the genocide in 1994. In the post-genocide environment, the country had been devastated economically, devastated obviously in personal terms as well. And so they needed to do some things in order to reboot the economy. What they tended to do, what the Rwandan government did in most sectors, what they tended to do was to liberalize the parts of the economy that had been working before the genocide, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. These liberalizations are very interesting. Kagame is a Tutsi minority group within Rwanda. The Tutsis were the people who, not entirely, but predominantly were massacred during the genocide. He runs the government. His army keeps the peace in Rwanda. It's a very peaceful place if you're a visitor there. But what he did was create economic liberalizations that empowered everyone within the society and maybe have had the most significant benefit for the Hutu majority in his country. So unlike maybe some liberalization efforts in Eastern Europe that tended to benefit former communist higher-ups, Kagame's liberalizations have tended to benefit people at the lower end of the income spectrum, and I'll talk about that. He's also had a strong emphasis, and you may be familiar with this effort as well, he's had a very strong emphasis within the government of Rwanda of increasing the climate for doing business. So this is another catchphrase in the development community. We want to see countries, the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, want to see countries now improving the climate for doing business. And how do you do this? How do you improve the climate for doing business? The World Bank has a very large project called the Doing Business Project that ranks countries in terms of how easy is it to do business in the various 183 countries of the world. Rwanda a couple of years ago was ranked at like number 156 out of 183. For the last 2 years, it's been one of the top performers worldwide in the world. So very strong emphasis on changing the legal and regulatory environment to make it easier for the private sector to do what the private sector wants to do, which is build businesses and promote job growth. Okay, very quickly about Rwanda. So these are the sort of stats. Most people now say about 800,000 people were killed in 100 days during the genocide. The economy was destroyed, contracted by 50%. Infrastructure's ruined across the country. Businesses are shot. There are literally millions of people displaced. Some people have fled to Uganda. Some have fled into Congo, which is where many of the Hutus went. The government knows in 1994 it's got what? It's got no roads. It's got no bridges. The economy's not functioning. It's got zillions of orphans in the country. People have suffered terrible injuries. There are psychological scars. There are real physical scars. And frankly, it needs money. The government needs some way to take care of the people who are left in the country. What's it going to do? Well, it could rely on aid, and actually Rwanda has gotten very substantial flows of aid over the past 15 years. But the government also said, well, look, we really want to jumpstart our economy. What can we do? And they knew one thing that they could do was focus on coffee production because they had been growing coffee since the 1930s. But what they had been growing was sort of poor grade commodity level coffee. Oftentimes when I talk about Rwanda and their coffee, I'll talk about the fact that Rwanda used to make the sort of stuff that my parents buy in that large red Folgers can. And so these guys are too young even to know that, right? My parents will go out and buy this gigantic 5-pound thing of coffee that I don't even want to hazard a guess at what it costs them. But they like it, and that's good for them. But what Rwanda said is, look, we can't really compete with Brazil. We can't really compete with the folks who are producing large volumes of coffee. What we can do is produce specialty coffee. We can produce a niche product that's going to be appealing to high-end consumers who are going to spend $10 to $15 a pound for a coffee that's grown in volcanic soil under good conditions. How are we going to get that to happen? Well, they had to change the legal environment in order to create a supportive and enabling environment for better coffee production. Here's what they had to do. In the past, before the genocide, every farmer in Rwanda had to grow coffee by law. You had an acre of land, you were required to plant 1/4 of an acre with coffee. You had to by law. and you had to sell your coffee beans to the government. And you had to sell your coffee beans to the government at a price the government set. And the price was never at the world market price. The price was always below world market price because the government would buy it, and then it would sell it at the world market price, and the government would keep the difference. And what did the government do with the price difference? Well, the government said what it would do is provide things like extension services and fertilizers to the farmers. But when you go talk to farmers who were growing stuff before 1994, they'll say, you know, we hardly ever saw those extension agents, and we hardly ever got fertilizer. What many of you may not know is that outside of the Soviet sphere, Rwanda was considered the most totalitarian society in the world before the genocide, in the 70s, 80s, and in the early 90s. So most of the money that the government was keeping was being used to support a very brutal totalitarian dictatorship. Lots of spying on neighbors was going on. There were weapons being purchased. So that's what the government was doing with the money it was buying. So post-genocide, what the government did is say, you know that law that says you have to grow coffee? Well, forget it. If you want to grow coffee, great. If you don't want to grow coffee, you choose. And by the way, you don't have to sell your coffee to us anymore. We're going to let you contract directly with foreign buyers. And, you know, if you think you can produce a pretty good product, then they're probably going to pay you more. And by the way, you know, we're not just going to be monopolizing the export of the beans. Not only can you contract directly with buyers, but we'll let other companies come into the country and help you ship your product out. Because you got to get coffee beans out of the country. Rwanda doesn't have a port. You've got to either ship them. Most coffee ships up to Mombasa in Kenya. So overall, competition is increased in the Rwandan coffee society, in the coffee sector, and what happens? Well, suddenly, there's a shift to an emphasis on quality production among coffee farmers who are very, very poor. 90% of the Rwandan population still works in the agricultural sector. The GDP per capita in Rwanda today is still under $500 per person. It's a very poor country, most people working at a subsistence level. But they know that if they can produce good quality specialty coffee, and these are coffee cherries on the bush, that they're going to be able to increase their incomes. Rather than being able to charge maybe $1 for a kilo of coffee, maybe they'll be able to earn $2 for a kilo of coffee. If you're a coffee farmer living on $300 a year, bumping up your annual income to $600 a year makes a really dramatic difference. If you can bump it up to $900 a year, even more dramatic. So the incentive is created through these legal and regulatory changes. The incentive is created to focus on producing high-quality coffee that's going to appeal to consumers here in the U.S. and in Europe and increasingly in Asia. But how can I do that if I'm a small farmer and almost all farmers in Rwanda are small farmers. The average size of a plot is actually about an acre. Maybe you have 100 trees, maybe you have 150 trees. How am I, and let's say it's me, let's say my husband was killed in the genocide by my neighbor, and I've got 4 kids, and I've got 100 coffee trees in my backyard, in my yard. How am I really, realistically, going to contract with Counterculture Coffee in North Carolina to sell my coffee beans for $3 a pound rather than $1 a pound? Am I going to be able to do that? Oh, by the way, I speak Kinyarwanda. I don't even speak French, which is one of the main languages. I definitely don't speak English. How am I going to contract with those folks over there? It's going to be really hard for me to do that. So what's your first name?
Rudy.
Rudy. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to go to Rudy and I'm going to say, Rudy, look, I'm actually not going to say this, but here's what I'm going to be thinking in my mind. I know Rudy is a real SOB, and he was involved in the genocide. And maybe he didn't kill my husband, but he probably has family who did. But you know what? I need to make a living. And I need to feed those 4 kids. And I can't do it on my own, growing the coffee by myself. I think Rudy and I actually probably need to work together. And if we can get Ari and Rudy and everyone in the 2nd row and the 3rd row and the 4th row, if we can get all of us together and we can work jointly, maybe now we're going to have enough folks, we're going to have enough coffee, we're going to have enough resources that we'll be able to find the people who want to pay more for good quality coffee. And this is basically what's happened in Rwanda. Smallholder farmers have formed together into cooperatives. They've had some help over the past 15 years